Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another episode of a Junior VC Behind the Scenes. On this week's episode, I have with me Varun, Raj, and Chandra, and we will talk about a Junior VC's piece, Can DeHaat Plant the Seeds for India's Agricultural Revolution? So to get us started, Raj, can you tell us a little bit about why we chose to write about DeHaat this week?
For sure. So it's really interesting why we chose DeHaat. On multiple fronts, we have noticed that agriculture in India, even though it's something which keeps us alive because of the food that it puts on our plates, not many founders have been very interested in disrupting the sector quite until 2012. So there's an interesting story, and that essentially picked up a lot of investor interest very lately. So something that's very topical, and they had picking up a round of 115 million Series D last year. Really super exciting. We really wanted to cover it for quite some time, but eventually we got to do it this weekend. Number two, been quite some time when we actually covered agritech as a sector. And thirdly, uh, right now there is a very interesting piece of disruption that could be possible in the agri-tech sector, and it looks nearer to us than further. So that's why we decided to cover the heart.
And it certainly is an interesting story. Can you tell us how they got started? What was DeHaat's founding story, Raj?
Absolutely. So imagine a situation where in 2008, a boy from IIT Delhi steps into the corporate world. Back in 2008, getting into IITs and graduating from IITs, getting into a top corporate job is something which was the dream of thousands, if not lakhs, of Indian students. Once you get in there, you have a successful career. You work with big corporations in your consulting capacity, and then you would eventually want to sort of either climb up the corporate ladder or shift to US. But then there is this interesting story about Shashank, who chooses to relocate to a very small rural village in Bihar called Vaishali. So what happened? For Shashank, he had his roots in farming. His family belonged to sort of farmers, and he knew a bit, like he was not totally agnostic of the impact agriculture had on livelihoods of his family, and of course, by continuation, on every family in the country.
It was
Number
a very
two,
personal problem for him. It was something that he had.
yeah, the first reason why he relocated, of course, it was a personal problem. The second thing is that his experiences in the 3.5 years of his corporate career was in the other end of the entire supply, the other end of this sort of industry where you have supply chains, you have retail, you have those connecting the downstream processes. And number three, in 2010s, essentially that was a time when startups actually started to become mainstream, with Flipkart, Jabong experiencing successes. And then Rashmi Bansal's book, Stay Foolish, Stay Hungry, was in bookshelves all around. And people started giving it a thought. And Shashank realizes that this is something which he can actually devote his entire life to. So he wanted to start up, he wanted to be an entrepreneur, but he didn't know how. So the first two dots essentially connected themselves, and Shashank realized that, you know what, why don't I pick up agriculture? Contributes 350 billion to India's GDP, which is a good 14-15%, employs 140 million plus farmers. So let's sort of get this sector disrupted. And eventually, that was the idea behind him relocating to a small village in Bihar, because unless you are in ground zero, you don't really understand the problem that you're trying to solve. So that was the founding story.
And it's
And really exciting things happened post that.
It's a perfect combination in the founder who has a problem that he has a personal connection to, and a strong passion to do something, to build a business. And let's kind of dive into a bit more about what problem they were solving. What was the pain point that he identified, and how is he going about tackling it?
Hey, one second, I missed you. Would you just repeat once again? Sorry.
I'll do it again. You can edit it. No worries. Uh, so wanted to dive a bit into the problem that he was solving. What was the pain point that he identified, and how was he going about tackling it?
Right. So the pain point that Shashank and his team had identified is that the entire farmer's cultivation life cycle, right from procurement of seeds till, let's say, post-harvest sales, has got multiple problems plaguing it. These problems, while they are at scale, the individual which whom these problems affected were very fragmented to take a collective actions. There needed to be sort of an aggregation, a scale at which these problems could be catered to. But then, of course, taking a step back, trying to understand how the journey of DeHaat's team looked like. Once relocated to ground zero for the first 2 years, they essentially had no business model. They had no idea how to generate revenues. They had no idea how to even raise funding, and what problem essentially they would solve. So essentially, going from a consulting viewpoint, you would really want to pick up the low hanging fruits first. And for them, the low hanging fruit was that why don't we source directly from the farmers, sell to big retail players like Cargill, Godrej, and eventually Zomato and Grofers. But then the 2 years that they had spent talking incessantly to farmers, learning about their problems, training them, getting to know the entire life cycle of each and every crop ground up, they realized that why don't we offer a full stack solution and ensure that right from seeds procurement, fertilizers procurement, offering working capital to the farmers, offering them access to better markets at better prices, helping them through the sowing season, uh, through the cultivation season, helping them customize their crops according to the soil type that they have on their land, and eventually helping them with post harvest sales, getting them good prices, as well as ensuring that the cycle repeats. This entire full stack solutioning can be provided by DeHaat. And that's how they realize that the problem that they're solving essentially is now no longer the post harvest season, but essentially the entire crop harvesting season, the crop cultivation season.
So it was almost like a 2-year discovery process of just kind of figuring out what problem they're solving. Just amazing. And so now, Chandra, maybe you can help us understand a bit more about how they got that early traction and found product market fit.
Sure, sure. Thanks, Mazin. And it's a really interesting story, like any startup. It's not always a linear path where you identify a solution and then suddenly you find product market fit. Right? You go through the learnings that you find. And DeHaat's a great example of that. So let's just start with the farmers, right? Imagine you're a farmer in a village. You've been farming the way you've been taught, your parents have been taught, your grandparents have been taught for like hundreds of years, right? And suddenly a 26 or 27-year-old kid comes in and he tells you, you know what? Here's how you change your way of cultivation. And you're reluctant to do that, right? You've been doing that your entire life. Yep. So basically, the stakeholders DeHaat was working with, they were resistant to change, right? So, and that became the challenge. How do you convince the farmers to adopt new practices? And how do you convince them to adopt new inputs, right? And so farmers thought, these guys don't really have skin in the game. It's just an adventure for them. Once things get tough, they're going to disappear. So how did they solve that, right? And how they did that was really interesting. The first was technology. So technology would give a way to scale this model. But smartphone penetration is low in rural India. And the medium of communication had to be in the vernacular or local language, right? Yeah. So you run into this interesting technological challenge that how do you provide low data consumption web access in multiple languages? And this is the kind of technical challenge.
It's not what you think about them solving. I mean, it's a very different challenge. It's more kind of bridging that communication gap rather than
exactly. Yeah. And it's a huge challenge. And like any budding entrepreneur, you look at this challenge, you're like, oh my God, there is a yoga. And finally, you've got the logistics infrastructure, right? So if you're going to be distributing the inputs like seeds and fertilizer and collecting the outputs like the harvest, you need a lot of capital investment to get the logistics in place. And most startups, they're like low assets, like a WeWork and Uber, you could just like start it in your garage, right? But instead here you have these high upfront costs that you need to bring this idea to reality. So like the chips were kind of stacked against DeHaat, and but they were like super motivated, and because it was such a big challenge, they were able to kind of rally themselves and solve it. And how did they do that? So they realized they had to demonstrate tangible improvements in the life of farmers. So instead of going on a top-down method, they decided, you know what? There's one farmer in this village. I'm going to focus my resources on winning over and working with that one farmer. And so once that person gets results, you've got like this loyal spokesperson or micro entrepreneur who become a cheerleader in the surrounding village radius, right? This is because when villagers hear stories from one of their own, they'd be more likely to try it versus being approached by a slick urban salesperson. So this was a game changer, all right? This micro entrepreneur model. They were able to deliver the agricultural services to farmers in a last mile way. And one more thing they did was something you wouldn't really associate with the tech company. They set up phone helplines so that they could engage with farmers in the language that they used to. So they basically solved the logistics barrier by enabling these micro entrepreneurs to act as a bridge between the platform and the farmers. So let's give an example of a day in the life of how this would work, right? So DeHaat buys high volume agricultural inputs, let's say thousands of kilos of fertilizers or seeds directly from the manufacturer. They store it in a warehouse that's operated by DeHaat, and that's the hub. Then you've got a spoke where DeHaat transports these inputs to the micro entrepreneurs who take care of last mile delivery. So that's one. So that's the first way of getting the inputs to farmers. And once the farmers create the produce, they bring it to the micro entrepreneur, and DeHaat collects it to their and brings it to their hub or warehouse, where they aggregate it and stock it and sell it to institutional buyers. So so it's a genius model that kind of came bottom up and organically from the challenges and context on the ground that they faced.
It really is fascinating. I mean, it's almost like an influencer sort of model, but
exactly
it fitted perfectly to their specific environment. How do they make money though? What do unit economics look like for DeHaat?
Okay, so so the thing is that the unit economics of something like this is very, very interesting, right? So let's just look at DeHaat's finances right now. So right now they have 1,300 centers. They serve 3.6 lakh farmers, right? And they're making about 100 odd crores in revenue each month. But how are they doing this? So Shashank, who's the founder of DeHaat, he says around 70% of the overall revenue comes from the sale of produce to big buyers, and 30% comes from the sale of agricultural inputs to farmers, and 1% comes from the financing services like loans. And they don't charge any money for advisory, right? So basically what they do is that they take a cut of every transaction inside the DeHaat ecosystem. So this leads to some interesting second order outcomes. So DeHaat wants to ensure that the participants in the ecosystem, the micro entrepreneurs, the farmers, they transact and interact more and more with each other. As they benefit, DeHaat benefits too. So those incentives are aligned. And this also creates a really virtuous cycle of network effects. So a farmer will join DeHaat for access to buyers and inputs, but the micro entrepreneur will join for access to farmer customers. And the institutional buyer, which is where the money is, they'll join because he gets streamlined access to bulk produce. So this is a three-sided marketplace, and it creates a virtuous cycle of growth and a lock-in effect as well.
It really is. That's a fascinating model and a very a unique model that they kind of built from the ground up, right? Really understanding the problem that they're solving, which is what makes it so interesting. Thank you so much for that, Chandra. Varun, can you expand a bit more on their growth phase? Once they had this model in place, how did they expand both sides of the marketplace and kind of build on these network effects that Chandra was explaining?
Yeah, I think I think there was an entrepreneur once said that when you're creating a category, it takes usually it takes longer than not, right? And it requires a great deal of patience. And I think the team showed a great deal of patience. Obviously, from 2012 onwards, like you've heard, they spent a lot of time understanding the problem, crafting the correct solution. And then through 18-19, they experienced real growth. I think they closed FY18 with about 21 crores revenue, and FY19 at 45, and both years being profitable, right? And this is when I think towards the end of FY19 was when they raised their first financing round, which was a $4.3 million round, which was led by Omnivore, right? And as you can imagine, the business had been around a long time, was not in necessarily the sexiest of sectors, and hence you needed somebody who understood the sector well to realize that what was happening, and it made sense for Omnivore and another agritech fund from the US to come in and lead the round, right? I think that by this point, there were a couple of things happening. While they had established the offline model and it was clearly working, what that offline model was really helping do was build trust, right, with the farmer. Because you have to understand that this community is far less tech savvy than what you may see in urban India. And having that physical outpost in every corner of the regions where they were operating had built trust. And as they built trust, it created a flywheel for word of mouth as well, right? Because the farmers went and told their friends, and eventually it became a hub of activity, right? Like you heard, the suppliers wanted to be there, the buyers wanted to be there, and that's what basically helped real scale come through. So by March 19, I think they were at 126 centers, and the company hadn't raised money, right? They had raised very little money prior to the Series A, but since they've raised the Series A, they've pretty much been on a treadmill of raising money, right? March 19 was the first round. Then towards March 20, they raised their second round. At which point they had about 450 centers. They were growing 3.5x year on year. Sequoia led that round. And then by January 21, they raised a third round, which saw Prosus come in. That was a $30 million round. And then later that year, in October, they raised a $115 million round. So as you can see, the time between rounds is actually getting shorter and shorter. And that's directly because of the growth that the company was experiencing. By the time they raised the Prosus round, they had about 1,350 offline centers. And by the time they had raised the $115 million round, they had close to 3,000 offline centers.
Incredible, incredible. So now they're at. So where exactly are they today in terms of how they stand, and does the competitive landscape look like in India?
Yeah, I think they're in a very interesting position today, right? I think one of the founders in an interview recently said they're in a position where they can launch 400 offline centers a month, right? It's basically become a cookie cutter model for them, right? They understand what needs to happen, how it needs to happen, and you just take the capital, go invest it. And it's a franchise model, right? So it doesn't even require a ton of capex. You actually make money when you start selling your franchisee. So obviously they can scale like crazy, and across the length and the breadth of the country. They've actually also acquired another company called Helicrofter, which was a B2B agri marketplace in Maharashtra. So far, they've been very strong in North India, specifically around the Bihar, UP regions. But now with this acquisition, they'll be able to expand to Western and Southern India. At the time of the last fundraise, they were doing about 100 crores in monthly revenue, and were expecting to close FY22 at 1,400 crores of revenue, right? And I think that was a big jump from about 352 they did the previous year. So as you can see, the company is now, I think, is reaping the benefits of all the investments that they made in the initial years of when they were basically doing the unglamorous stuff of living in villages, talking to farmers, understanding the problems, so on and so forth. They're also now in a position to tack on more and more services, right? They already had crop advisory services and those sorts of things. They've recently launched financing, so access to credit. I think very quickly they had scaled up to about 75 crores of credit dispersed on their platform. Again, the beauty is now they've established the platform. They built the pipe, right? And what's flowing through the pipe, they don't have to produce, and they just take a take rate on it, right? So very asset light in that manner.
And because it's
Um,
Android, they have these kind of network effects. They keep kind of
Absolutely. Yeah. And this is where I think the competition question is interesting, right? They have they operate across the value chain or supply chain from a farmer's perspective and an agriculture perspective, right? None of their competitor, they do not have a competitor, a like for like competitor who competes with them in their way, in their business model, right? Um, uh, they have specific competitors across each part of their supply chain, right? So whether that's the input side, the marketplace side, and then on the financing side, which includes insurance as well, right? But per se, no, there's nobody who does exactly what they do. So it's interesting whether you think of those guys as collaborators or competitors. Some of them may actually want to collaborate with somebody like DeHaat, because they get access to 650,000 farmers that the platform has, that the business has on its platform today, right? And that's a huge community that many of these businesses may want to access. There are the traditional Indian enterprises, whether that's the Tatas, the Godreges, or the ITCs, that have established some sort of a similar business, and that they have distribution centers from where they procure. But they are more focused on procuring for their own needs in terms of ITC, needs the raw materials to support their FMCG business. Similarly, with Godrej, needs to support their FMCG business on the oils and other side. So I think obviously compared to those guys, these guys will move faster, be more nimble. And again, I think ITC has 6,000 distribution points. These guys are already at 3,500, right? And they've done it in a very short period of time. With the capital that they now have available, they should be able to scale really, really quickly going forward as well.
Thanks so much for that. It definitely sounds like DeHaat has a bright future ahead of them, and are very uniquely positioned. They took the time to solve the problem from the ground up, and it's really paying dividends now. Thank you everyone for tuning in to this week's episode of our Junior VC Behind the Scenes, and we'll see you again next week.